Fault mostly, so.
Yeah, well, I blame the world.
Well, yes, fair enough.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Dustin Siebel. I'm a fellow here at the Stockdale Center. It's a great pleasure to be up here with Peter Berkowitz and Yuval Levin to discuss virtue. Peter Berkowitz is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and the author of numerous books. Yuval Levin is director of social, cultural, constitutional studies at the American Enterprise Institute and also the author of numerous books. And we'll start, I think, with Peter. Okay.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with my fellow panelists, and thanks to Ed and the Naval Academy for this opportunity. I thought it might be useful, do something unusual, for me at least, to approach the panel's topic, civic virtue, its decline, its reinvigoration, from a somewhat autobiographical perspective. Long ago and far away, when I went to college, the cutting-edge topic was something that we called, in grave tones, the critique of liberalism. And we had leading authors and books. I was at Swarthmore College. We read a book called Knowledge and Politics by Roberto Unger, a kind of mad genius. I underlined both words. We read the writings of Charles Taylor, and we read the writings of Alasdair MacIntyre. We were especially influenced by a book called After Virtue. Some of you who study political theory may be familiar with this book. The core argument of MacIntyre's book, of great interest, again, to those of us who are interested in the critique of liberalism, where liberalism, of course, meant the modern tradition of freedom. MacIntyre's core argument is going to be familiar to many of you, especially those of you who follow debates about post-liberalism. So MacIntyre's argument 40 years ago was, we've lost the ability to speak coherently about the virtues, excellences of mind and character. We've even forgotten, we modern contemporary men and women, we've forgotten that the virtues are central to the moral life. The culprit is liberalism, the modern tradition of freedom. Now, according to MacIntyre, Nietzsche exposed the incoherence of this modern tradition of freedom, and Nietzsche showed that the modern tradition of freedom inevitably deteriorates into nihilism. But, argued MacIntyre, somehow Nietzsche's criticisms did not reach the thinking of pre-modern figures, most notably Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition. Therefore, argued MacIntyre, and After Virtue, our choice was a stark one: Nietzsche and nihilism, or the Aristotelian tradition and the virtues. Faced with that stark choice, all reasonable people would choose, of course, Aristotle. In practice, that meant the Aristotelian tradition, which of course includes Aquinas' synthesis of Aristotle and Christianity. Again, that outline of the history of political philosophy should sound familiar, especially to those of you who've been following contemporary debates and the views of the post-liberals. Now, I want to assert, I can only be brief here, of course, that MacIntyre's analysis was wrong in all major respects. I say that as someone who has, who greatly admires Alasdair MacIntyre, from whom I've learned more than from almost any other thinker. Nevertheless, I believe he was wrong about Nietzsche, wrong about Aristotle, and wrong about the modern liberal tradition. Here I can mostly only assert these claims and sketch what I think is a better view, but I hope that the assertions and the sketch will shed some light on our question, civic virtue in a liberal or rights-protecting democracy. And what I say about McIntyre, I think, applies to the post-liberal critique of liberalism. First, McIntyre misrepresents Nietzsche's critique of philosophy. Nietzsche did not show that specifically modern philosophy was an expression of will, and he did not believe himself to have shown that. Nietzsche actually believed he had accomplished something much more radical. He believed to have established that all great philosophy, Plato and Aristotle no less than Locke and Kant, and actually Plato more culpably than all of modern philosophy, was reducible to the moral intentions of the philosophers themselves, and all rationalism, beginning with Plato down to the moment Nietzsche was thinking in the middle of the 19th century, all of it culminated in nihilism. So, contrary to McIntyre, Nietzsche's critique embraced classical and medieval political philosophy. Second, contrary to McIntyre, Aristotelian political science does not dictate the repudiation of liberal democracy, a regime based on the premise that human beings are by nature free and equal. Aristotelian political science does not demand its replacement with a regime devoted to the promotion of virtue. Rather, Aristotelian political science sets forth an alternative way of understanding liberal democracy. An alternative, however, that takes the regime as it is, based on the premise of natural freedom and equality, devoted to protecting rights, and focuses on, the Aristotelian political science that is, focuses on liberal democracy's defining principles and looks for ways to preserve and improve liberal democracy. In the politics, Aristotle does describe a best regime that is devoted to promoting virtue. He does not, however, to put it gently, count on its realization. More or less, he advises that you are extremely unlikely, not just at this moment in the 21st century, but in ancient Greece as well. You're extremely unlikely to live in a regime devoted to the promotion of virtue. And Aristotle adds, you're extremely unlikely to find yourself in a circumstance that allows you to build the best regime. The most we can reasonably hope for is an imperfect regime. Aristotle calls it polity. It's a regime in which some people, they're in the minority, are wealthy. The majority tends to be is less wealthy, and they're balanced by a large middle class. Each class contributes distinctive virtues and vices to this mixed regime. In short, particularly if you live in a regime that recognizes democratic freedom and equality, Aristotelian political science recommends measures of accommodation, balance, and calibration to prevent your regime from deteriorating into something much worse. So much for Nietzsche and Aristotelian political science. McIntyre's third big error. He wrongly argues that liberalism, better to call it the modern tradition of freedom, repudiates or renders incoherent the moral virtues. So, a few decades ago now, inspired by McIntyre, I actually set out to write a book that more or less vindicated that thesis, that the liberal tradition repudiates or renders incoherent an account of moral virtue. Before I began writing in earnest, I undertook to do due diligence, so I resolved to reread some major figures in this modern tradition of freedom, Hobbes, Locke, Kant, and Mill, just to make sure there were no stray mentions of virtue here and there. And that I could establish that the liberal tradition was not only repudiated the virtues, but was intrinsically incapable of giving an account. I started with Hobbes, who seemed to me the easiest case. Maybe not a liberal, a kind of proto-liberal. He does affirm inalienable rights. He does say government's job is to protect them. But he was also known as the monster of Malmesbury. He had a political theory based on a crude mechanistic understanding of nature and a hedonistic view of humanity. So of course he had no room for virtue. Then I began rereading Leviathan. And right there in the introduction, I thought maybe I had a misbegotten copy of it, but right there in the introduction, first page, Hobbes says, all serious study of politics is based on the Socratic maxim, know thyself. And that to engage in political science, one had to study one's own passions, compare those passions to the passions of others, and reason from the passions. This didn't sound mechanistic, and it sounded connected to what I understood to be a political science that appreciated the virtues, qualities of excellences of mind, of character. So I was only slightly thrown off. Then I got to the end of chapter 15 of Leviathan. Chapter 15 culminates through three crucial chapters in which Hobbes discusses the state of nature and lays out 19 laws of nature that enable us to leave the state of nature and create political society. 19 laws of nature. And at the end of chapter 15, he says that the ways or means to peace are justice, gratitude, modesty, equity, mercy, and the rest of the laws of nature, which are good, that is to say, moral virtues. And he adds, now the science of virtue and vice is moral philosophy. I set out to write a book that said this tradition knows nothing of the virtues, following McIntyre, and can't make sense of them. And here Hobbes is telling me at the end of chapter 15 that actually, he adds, the laws of nature are not really laws. The conclusions are theorems. And more than that, they name qualities of mind and character. And with each additional thinker I studied, I had a similar experience. I will only mention Locke here. Locke, much maligned, taken as a kind of demonic figure by the post-liberals, the turning point, who is responsible for establishing a philosophy obsessively focused on individual freedom, but an individual freedom that really means radical emancipation from all external causes. Locke is really a postmodern. But there I am, rereading John Locke. I come to chapter 6, in the middle of an account in a small book, the second treatise, a book that's an account, the origins, the extent, the aims of political power, a chapter on education and the family, and parents' essential role in preparing their children, daughters as well as sons, for lives of freedom by disciplining them, by teaching them the virtues. And then I am guided to a book called Some Thoughts Concerning Education. In Some Thoughts Concerning Education, John Locke, who is typically presented once again as obsessed radically with freedom, provides a manual for parents on how to educate their children. What is at the heart of Lockean education? The moral virtues. To enjoy freedom and to maintain free institutions, argues Locke, children need to be raised and disciplined by their parents in a way to inculcate a whole range of qualities of mind and character. Locke insisted that the moral virtues were essential to a society based on freedom. One could say something simpler about Kant and Mill and many others in the modern tradition of freedom. To conclude, what about today? We certainly do suffer from a dearth of civic virtue. One can identify a multiplicity of causes: modernity, secularization, the unraveling of the traditional family, the decline of community. Does liberal democracy itself undermine the virtues necessary to its survival, as the post-liberals are so fond of saying? Answer: yes, of course it does. But I immediately add this very important qualification. Liberal democracy undermines the virtues on which it depends by taking its principle, the principle of individual freedom, to an extreme. But the post-liberals who are so fond of making this argument, especially in the name of Aristotle, forget Aristotle's teaching, which is also Plato's teaching. All regimes, not just liberal democracy, all regimes undermine the virtues necessary to their survival by taking their leading principles to an extreme. This is a problem of all regimes. The proper response, therefore, is not to denounce and overthrow liberal democracy, especially given its great blessings: individual freedom, equality under law, prosperity, and toleration. Instead, the proper response is to devise reforms to counteract the diseases to which liberal democracies are prone. I intend the echo to the conclusion of Federalist number 10. Today, what are the key virtues that we should be concerned about? A long topic. But for starters, liberal democracies depend on civility, toleration, sympathetic imagination, prudence, moderation, and courage. These are both civic virtues, the virtues connected to citizenship, and moral virtues, the virtues connected to excellences of human beings. How should liberal democracies cultivate the virtues they need? In liberal democracies, we don't rely primarily on government for the cultivation of virtues, but don't make the mistake that therefore virtues are unimportant. We rely on civil society, especially the family. But the most important factor, I believe most under our control today, is education, the educational system. We need to revive a liberal education. That's an education for freedom. Such an education would focus on, after literacy, reading, writing, arithmetic, the principles of American constitutional government and the history of America, would focus on larger Western civilization, understanding the treasures of Western civilization and preserving them. And students would also learn about other civilizations. And the entire education, from youth through higher education, would ensure that students hear the other side of the argument, because in education in which you hear the other side of the argument is one that promotes the virtues we so desperately need. Happy to elaborate on these and other themes during the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. I'm very much going to pick up on some of the themes that that Peter brought out. It's a great honor to be on a panel with him and with Dustin, and to be here speaking to all of you on really a crucial set of questions. When I sat down to think about what to say here, I looked at the agenda, and the name of our panel is just Virtue. That's nice, but I needed a little more, and I sent Ed a note and asked him, what is the question we are answering here? And he wrote back to me saying, the question for your panel is, quote, how should liberal democracies cultivate the civic virtues they need? And that's actually a very rich question, which I really like a lot. And I'm going to try to answer that question by thinking about the question just a little bit. It's a question that assumes, to begin with, several important premises that I think are right, but that are worth really stating explicitly. The first of these is that a liberal democracy or a democratic republic requires certain particular virtues. I think that's true of any society, and the virtues that every society requires are related to the kind of society that it is or that it wants to be. So that our society, which is a liberal democratic republic, requires certain liberal and democratic and republican virtues. Exactly what those are, Peter started to get into that some. I think it's a long and contested question, but maybe we can agree that as a liberal democracy, we require some virtues like toleration and forbearance and patience and humility, and that as a republic, we require some virtues like responsibility and courage and honesty and magnanimity and faith. Republican virtues and liberal virtues are compatible up to a point, though there's also some tension between them. But those, I think, are the kinds of virtues that we need to instill and to cultivate to sustain our society's strengths. The second premise, beyond the fact that our society needs certain particular kinds of virtues, is that societies cultivate or tend to produce certain kinds of virtues. I think that's also plainly true. The way in which we live tends to shape the kind of people that we are. And societies, by their practices, by their habits and assumptions and forms and historical self-understandings, tend to shape particular sorts of people. So our society needs a certain kind of person, and our society shapes a certain kind of person. And the question for us is, how can those two be aligned? How can we cultivate the kind of people that we also need in order to sustain the strengths of our society? I think we have to see that this will not happen on its own, by inertia, by default. We have to do it explicitly and intentionally. And maybe that's especially true in a liberal democracy. I think there's no avoiding the fact that left to ourselves, we citizens of a democratic republic will often tend to ignore our obligations to one another and to the larger society. We'll remember our rights, but not our duties. We'll remember what we are owed, but not what we owe. We incline to an excessive individualism. We forget that the free and responsible individual is less a natural fact than a social achievement that we have to work to sustain. I think that's true in any society, that it will tend to become an excessive form of what it is fundamentally, and will turn its virtues into vices. But in some ways, because we are free, this is especially true of our kind of society. And it's also true that we particularly will tend to neglect the republican virtues, the virtues that are essential to government by the people, in which we all have to play a civic role and for which we all have to take some joint responsibility. We'll tend to neglect the ways by which it becomes possible for the citizens of a free society to understand themselves as engaged in some common effort on behalf of some common good, and so to speak of our country in the first person plural, as we the people, as we who hold certain truths to be self-evident. The freedom and equality and prosperity and sheer manic energy of a liberal society tend to make us forgetful of these virtues, even though these are all dependent on those virtues. Free societies don't coerce people to do the right thing, and so they can only really succeed if people generally choose to do the right thing, if what we want to do and what we ought to do are more or less roughly aligned. And that requires serious attention to the formation of our desires, to teaching us what to want. That kind of attention is actually more essential in a free society than in a non-free society, and it's especially essential in a free society that wants to govern itself, in a liberal democracy that is a republic. As James Madison puts it in Federalist 55, republican government presupposes the existence of these kinds of virtues in a higher degree than any other form of government. And yet the dominant ethos of liberal democratic life can sometimes undermine that kind of attention to the formation of our desires. It can tell us that whatever we want is good. It can turn our attention away from precisely the cultivation of virtues. I think there is not a way around that fact of liberal life, but that reality is not in itself an argument against liberal democracy. It cannot deny the extraordinary moral achievement that is a society of free people living together as fellow citizens despite their differences, or the extraordinary balance of dynamism and prosperity and moral purpose and commitment to human dignity that our particular liberal democracy has achieved over these 2.5 centuries. The fact that the liberal ethos can undermine the preconditions for its own society is not an argument against that society. It is rather an argument for working consciously and conscientiously to cultivate the ethos of our society, to push against some of the vicious tendencies of liberal democratic life and cultivate its more virtuous potentials. Can we do that? Of course we can do that. Look around you. We can do that. We do it all the time. It's too easy when we look at our country now to see the ways that it's failing or the ways that our culture is corroding and our trust in one another is declining. It's true. All those things are happening. They're not made up. But it's essential that when we look at our country, we first see what it is doing well so that we can see how it might realistically address the many things it does do poorly. And our country does a lot of this work of cultivation very well. It produces the kind of people that attend the Naval Academy and the kind of people who in a vast variety of ways all over our country are working hard to form the next generation of Americans and to sustain our society's strengths. That happens in countless communities in America all the time, in religious congregations and in classical schools, in many pockets of sanity throughout higher education, in a vast array of bottom-up political and economic and cultural efforts to strengthen our society. That kind of work is always threatened, and in some respects it is threatened now more intensely than usual, but it goes on. And to pretend that it's no longer possible is, I think, ultimately just to shirk the work of doing it, which is hard work. We do cultivate essential virtues, but Ed's question to me began with an important word. The word is how. How do we cultivate these virtues? And so how can we do it better? That question, I would argue, requires us to think about a subject that free and liberal societies, which are therefore often individualistic societies, tend to like to avoid. It requires us to think about institutions. When we think about our society, we naturally tend to imagine it as a kind of vast open space that's filled with individuals making choices for themselves. Sometimes we see that these individuals are having trouble connecting with each other, and so we work to address that by looking for ways to connect them. We talk about taking on loneliness and isolation through various sorts of metaphors of building bridges and tearing down walls. I think there's value in that kind of thinking, but that it actually ultimately mistakes the character of our social life because it ignores the structure of social life and the forms of common action that makes it possible. If our society is a vast open space, it's not just a space filled with individuals. It's a space filled with these forms and structures of social life, a space filled with institutions. Institution is a very broad and vague sort of term, but for the sake of simplicity here, we can say that institutions are precisely the forms of our common life, the shapes, the structures of what we do together. Some institutions are organizations. The Naval Academy is an institution, so is a hospital or a business or a church. They're technically, legally formalized. Some institutions are forms of a different sort. Maybe they're still shaped by laws or norms, but they're not exactly organizations. The family is the first and foremost institution of any society. We can talk about a profession like medicine as an institution, or the rule of law. Institutions are durable. They keep their shape over time. They tend to change only slowly and gradually. A flash mob is not an institution. But most important, what's distinct about an institution is that it is a form in the deepest sense. A form is a structure. It's the shape of the whole. And a social form, an institution, is not just a bunch of people. It's a bunch of people ordered together to achieve a purpose, to pursue a goal, to advance an ideal. The institution gives each of them a role in relation to each other and in relation to the purpose they're trying to achieve together. It says you're a student and you're a teacher, you're a principal. Each of you has certain kinds of responsibilities and obligations and privileges because of that role, and together you're pursuing the education of the rising generation. That's the purpose of a school. And that means that institutions are also, by their nature, formative of us. They structure our interactions with each other, and so they structure each of us. They shape our habits and our expectations. They shape our character. They shape our soul. They help to form us, and in that way, they also cultivate some distinct virtues in us. They are often the answer to the how question. When you're shaped by an institution, precisely because you're given a role. You're not just a person floating out there in the world. You're a student at this school or a doctor at that hospital. You're a member of that church or a worker at that factory, and that gives you a particular kind of character, a particular set of goals and boundaries and behaviors. There's such a thing in the world as a lawyer or a dentist. You'll run into people who you'll talk to for a little while, and then you ask them what they do, and they'll say, I'm an accountant, or I'm a Marine, and you think, yeah, I'd already guessed that. And the reason you had is precisely because you have some expectations about how institutions form people. Institutional life is often where virtues are cultivated. And what happens inside of our institutions that makes that cultivation possible is not just instruction, but example and habituation above all. We're shaped to live in a certain way by watching others, by acting ourselves in ways that give us virtuous habits. And so the challenge of cultivating the habits of our democratic republic is a challenge to our institutions. Our failures of formation are very often institutional failures, failures of the family, of community, of professional institutions, of educational institutions, religious institutions. So that successful formation of citizens in a democratic republic requires healthy institutions that are geared to habituating us in those virtues. And because those virtues sometimes cut against the ethos of liberal democracy itself, some of our most important institutions have to cut against that ethos too. Many institutions that are essential to liberal democracy are not themselves liberal and democratic. The family is not a democracy. Neither is the Naval Academy. The habits that they give us are the habits of a free society, but they're not always the habits that a free society will cultivate if just left to itself. And so although they are culture shaping, they're also countercultural. They shape our culture precisely by keeping it in tension with itself. And that tension is the kind of secret sauce of American life. Every kind of society tends to go to excess and to turn its virtues into vices. And every kind of society, therefore, requires a kind of moderation of those vices. That's what a lot of our institutions do for us. And people inside those institutions, especially the people with the most authority and power in them, have to think consciously about the formative part that they play and that these institutions play. And so about what kind of example they're setting, what kind of habits they're creating in the people that are shaped by the institutions they run. Part of what that means is that leaders of these institutions have to work to sustain people's trust in the institutions they're responsible for by upholding their end of the bargain, by doing their core jobs. For people in positions of leadership and of authority, but in some ways for all of us, since we all have some important parts to play in some important institutions, that often has to start by asking the great unasked question of this moment. Given my role here, how should I behave? That is what somebody who takes an institution they're involved with seriously asks in a moment of decision. And a lot of the trouble that's facing our core institutions now could be described as a very widespread failure to ask that kind of question. Given my role here, how should I behave? As a member of Congress, or a soldier, or a sailor, or a student, or a teacher, what should I be doing here? It's a question that can make us better, because in a moment of decision, it can force us to think about what's expected of us, what's required of us, to think about what would be responsible, and not just what do I want. We can all, I think, easily think of some everyday situations where that kind of question makes a difference. If I'm driving on the highway and somebody cuts me off and I want to tell them what I think of them, but I remember that the kids are in the back seat, I don't do it. And that is, in a very simple sense, how our institutions shape us. They force us to think about what role we have that requires us to behave in some particular way. A lot of the people that we most respect now seem to think about that kind of question before they make important judgments. And a lot of the people who drive us crazy, who seem to be part of the problem in this moment, seem to fail to ask that question when they very obviously should. The appeal of ignoring that question is very powerful. There's a strong temptation now for many of our key institutions to abandon their core work and instead just treat the institution as a kind of platform for performance, for making a political statement, or for sending a cultural message, or just getting more followers on social media, rather than playing the particular role assigned to us in the institutions that matter to us. That temptation is deadly to trust, and it's deadly to institutional integrity, and therefore it's also deadly to the work of cultivating the virtues that are most crucial to our democratic republic. You feel that pressure here. the pressure to be just another place where the prejudices of our elite culture are mindlessly reaffirmed over and over again, rather than a place with a distinct role and purpose and mission and character that is willing to be countercultural when it needs to, in order to secure the preconditions for our society's future. It's an irony of life in a free society, but also a source of great strength for it, that in a free society, many of our crucial institutions are, as I've said, countercultural. They're always pushing against the tide of fashion and conventional wisdom, cultivating virtues that are in active tension with the default tendencies of our society. To remain free and liberal and Republican, our society has to be sure that it sustains the space for these institutions, even, maybe especially, when they aren't always liberal institutions themselves. The space for family and religion and a genuinely searching education, for military virtues and traditional ideas. Guarding our capacity to cultivate these virtues requires guarding the institutions that cultivate them and the space in which those institutions can work. It means insisting on the ability of parents to make choices about how their children are raised. It means insisting on the genuine freedom of religious communities. It means teaching and learning even those ideas that pose real challenges to contemporary mores and assumptions. Our system of government, and I'll close here, is actually very aware of this need to facilitate formation within institutions. We often think, for example, of the key rights that are protected by the First Amendment as purely individual rights to do whatever you want. But if you actually look at those rights, they are rights to participate in formative institutions, institutions that teach us what to want. The freedom of assembly obviously can't be practiced individually, but neither really can the freedom of the press, or of speech, or of petition, or even religious freedom that necessarily comes first in the First Amendment. These are all rights that adhere in individuals, but they are rights of individuals to participate in the lives of institutions and communities in necessarily formative ways. Our society can cultivate the virtues it requires by working to keep its core institutions from the family on up strong and free and protected. And we as individuals can cultivate those virtues in ourselves and others by self-consciously embracing our roles in these institutions. We often fail on both of these crucial fronts now at the same time, and doing better will require us to understand how virtues are cultivated, why institutions matter, and what the freedom of a free society is ultimately for and about. These are just the questions you're taking up in these 2 days. So again, thank you very much for involving me in these important conversations.
So we have a short time for questions if folks want to queue up at the mics.
First off, thank you for taking your time to come out and speak with us. You spoke of Nietzsche and nihilism. When referring to his ideas and solutions in Zarathustra, what is your take on the pursuit of the overman and its relevance to individual liberty in a liberal democracy, given its radical departure from traditional community values as symbolized by the metamorphosis of a camel?
It's my fault, but I haven't been asked a question like that, and Lord knows how long, and I'm delighted to be asked the question about beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. That speech, Zarathustra's opening speech, is an effort for Zarathustra to describe the metamorphosis of the Superman. 3 stages. The first stage, as camel, you submit to discipline. What Nietzsche had in mind in Beyond Good and Evil, he speaks about the tyranny of capricious laws being the source of all moral virtue. The second stage is the lion shaking off the values, 1,001 values, the values of tradition. And the third stage, it's actually the character that Zarathustra gives this job to, is the child who invents sacred games, festivals of atonement, a radical form of creation. From my point of view, Nietzsche's sketch of the 3 metamorphoses of the spirit shows how, in a sense, utopian and unrealistic. Nietzsche is ultimately to be radically free of inherited values, traditions, disciplines, institutions, is to be A, childlike, and B, to yourself become responsible for creating holy rites, holy, H-O-L-Y, holy rites and ceremonies. And from my point of view, the achievement of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is to demonstrate that this original dream of being wholly free of traditions and inherited values cannot be achieved and does lead to nowhere. And therefore, that gives us a motive for reconsidering what Nietzsche Zarathustra sought to repudiate: discipline, tradition, both the modern tradition of freedom and the Aristotelian tradition.
Thank you, sir.
I love everything about that exchange so much.
Thank you to all you gentlemen for your speeches. My question specifically was for Dr. Levin. On institutions, you mentioned the family and the Naval Academy as some good institutions that are countercultural. But besides those, in your view, what are some of the best and worst institutions of shaping the Republican virtues that our liberal society often lacks? And besides embracing our roles, where we are, growing where we're planted, as you said, what can be done to change and improve these institutions, especially when you mentioned that they so slowly change over time?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think the challenge for us is that a lot of the key institutions that are necessary for that kind of formation are in terrible shape now. They don't recognize their own purpose, their own part in that very important work of civic formation and of soul forming. So that the question is not exactly which institutions to look to. We have to look to family, we have to look to school, we have to look to church, we have to look to university, we have to look to our political system too. But in each of those cases, in one way or another, there is work to be done. I think that's always true. But we find ourselves now in a moment when a lot of them are confused about their role and really about the character of our society and even the character of human flourishing itself in ways that are connected and that require concerted work to reacquaint ourselves with the foundations of civic virtue and of the liberal society. Some of that work, as I said, has to be rather countercultural work. It's critical work. And so it belongs in places like universities, where it is not happening enough. And it belongs, in a sense, in our larger culture's efforts to understand itself and combat its worst vices. I think part of the reason to surface this idea of institutions, an institution, in a free society, when things are going well, we don't need to think about institutions, and we don't like to. We like to imagine that we're just doing what we want. But before we do what we want in a way that won't destroy us all, we have to be taught what to want. And the institutions that teach us what to want are in trouble now. I think that requires us to dig to the bottom of what a lot of them are for and to think very hard about what our society requires, what it's good at, what it's not, where it needs help, where it needs us. And that means that this is a moment that requires some really foundational and fundamental work, conversations like this one.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, gentlemen. This question is for Dr. Levin. So I think an institution that we haven't discussed so far is the role of the media that plays. I feel like a lot of the institutions that you reference, education, Congress, are shaped by the media that we have today. Instead of Cronkite telling us the way it is, we have institutions driven by shareholders and engagement and clicks, which drives congressional leaders not to provide apt discussion in Congress, but often for showmanship, for more views. So how do you feel that the media plays a role in shaping people in the way that you stated institutions often do?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with you in part. I'm not so nostalgic for Walter Cronkite telling us how it is. That just wasn't very often how it really was. And I think it is important for us to recognize that that control of the flow of information really shouldn't be too tightly constricted. There are a lot of ways in which the America of the middle of the 20th century, that nostalgia for which is essentially the theme of our politics in the last 25 years, actually had a lot of problems. And there are ways in which some of their vices were the opposite of ours, so we sort of missed that time. But they had too much confidence in elite institutions, where we have too little. They had they were too constricted and solidified a society where we are too fragmented and degenerative. So there are things we can learn from the ways in which that society did things very differently. But look, coming out of 2 world wars and a depression, the America of the middle of the 20th century was just intensely cohesive and consolidated. And we are not that. I think we have to think about how to get from where we are to a more functional version of the free society in a way that is relatively free of nostalgia for the middle of the 20th century, much as that time can still teach us. I think instead that we have to think about those foundational questions, about what's required for us from where we are now to be a free society. Media certainly has a role here, and look, in a sense, the collapse of trust that we've witnessed in so many institutions began earliest with our collapse of trust in the media. Some of it is driven by economic motives, as you suggest. The basic economic model of journalism is very different now than it was in that heyday. But I think the media is responding to the character of our social life in a way that should force us to think about more than media. It's exemplifying a kind of institutional dysfunction that is evident in many other institutions. Because in the press, as in Congress, as in universities and corporations, you find people who should be playing a part within an institution, instead standing on it and performing and building a personal following and building a personal brand and systematically making it impossible for us to trust them. There's a way to think about that that's distinct to media, but I think we have to think about that as a larger pattern, because it really is the larger pattern of the 21st century in America so far.
Very quickly, I want to add to what Yuval said. I agree with his warning about nostalgia, which was once defined as a longing for a time that never was. But still, I think we should keep in mind 2 differences between, let's say, the era of Walter Cronkite and our era. Or even if you go back to the 1960s, if you strolled through the newsroom at the Washington Post, most of the reporters you would have found at the Post were not graduates of elite universities. Today, if you stroll through the newsroom at the Washington Post, you'll discover that most of those who are reporting on the news, to say nothing of those who are opining, are the products of elite education, in much more so than actually in the supposed time of unity. The mainstream media, members of the mainstream media were educated in the same schools, received the same set of values, and especially in these days, I would say even were inculcated with, if not indoctrinated, a common set of ideas. At the same time, because of the digital era, we all now can personally tailor our news feeds and create cocoons around ourselves. So as the mainstream media, the Post, the New York Times, the networks, and so on, have become more unified, it's easier and easier for each of us to encase ourselves in our own almost private conversations, so that it's become harder to because we haven't read the same articles, essays every day. It becomes harder for us to engage in a common conversation across party lines and now identity lines. So I just emphasize that those as challenges we face today.
I think, by the way, this point about consolidation of elites is very important beyond the media, too. The United States really used to stand out for having a diversity of elites. It was very different from Europe in this respect. The people who ran big corporations were just very different from the people who ran major city newspapers or the people who ran the union, or the people who ran a government agency, or the people who, or a Hollywood studio, or were chair of the English department at Brown. Those people are actually very, very similar to each other now. They are essentially interchangeable. And one of the things that means is that the deformations of our universities matter much more than they used to, because the universities form elites across our society in a way that they simply did not used to do until fairly recently in American life. It's one of the reasons why people who worry about American society are so obsessed with universities. That isn't just a function of their own background. That's a function of a change in our society that I think is really worth noticing.
So you've heard some very fine speeches about virtue today, but someone might think that actions speak louder than words. And so I'm going to practice virtue here before your very eyes by ending on time. Thank you to our panelists, and thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Good final.
All right. Thanks again for your good questions, and we'll come back at let's say 11:40 sharp. 11:40.